We begin the day with what looks like an attempt by U.S. President Trump to undermine relations with Europe. In an interview with Politico, which this week also declared Trump the most influential man in Europe, the U.S. president dismisses the continent as decaying and weak, as a place that he doesn't even really like. His words underscore a new U.S. national security strategy released last Friday, which wants to improve America's relationship with Russia. And that requires a quick end to the war in Ukraine. But Trump accuses Ukraine's President Zelensky of clinging to power by using the war to postpone elections. Well, today, Zelensky said that Ukraine is willing to hold elections within 3 months if the U.S. and Europe guarantee security.
They're using war not to hold an election, but I would think the Ukrainian people would, should have that choice, and maybe Zelensky would win. I don't know who would win, but they haven't had an election in a long time. They talk about a democracy, but it gets to a point where it's not a democracy anymore.
Well, in Moscow, they like what they're hearing from Trump. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says Trump's views on NATO and territorial concessions are in alignment with Russia's position, and that also includes Ukrainian President Zelensky's willingness to hold elections despite the war.
Of course, we have carefully read the section of the Politico interview that relates to us and to the Ukraine settlement. It's a very important interview, a very important statement. It largely matches our understanding regarding Ukraine's NATO aspirations, regarding territory, and regarding how Ukraine is losing land. President Trump has pointed to the root causes of the conflict, which is very important for the prospects of a peaceful resolution.
All right, there's a lot to unpack tonight. I want to pull in Ian Bremmer now. He is a political scientist and founder and president of the political risk consulting firm Eurasia Group. He joins us from New York City. It's good to see you, Ian. Let's pick up with what we heard there from Peskov. He didn't just welcome Trump's comments. He said that Trump's framing of NATO, of territory, and Ukraine matches Russia's own analysis. Is it simply exploiting Trump's language, or is it reading something real about the direction of U.S. policy?
Sure. I think the most important point is that the United States, under the Trump administration and the Kremlin, share one rather important strategic goal in foreign policy, which they both believe that a weak European Union, or even a disintegrated European Union, is a preferable foreign policy goal. The Kremlin is pleased, and they've made very clear, not just with Trump's Politico interview, but also with the national security strategy, that the Kremlin is broadly aligned with the goals that are elucidated there. Now, usually, in this environment, if the Kremlin says they like what you're doing, you probably should rethink what you're doing. And certainly European leaders, almost all of them, perhaps not Viktor Orban in Hungary, but almost all of them, are going to be deeply concerned about what they've heard from the Trump as president, as also from the Trump administration over the past few days, that feels like the United States is becoming an adversary. And, Europe has a lot of adversaries these days.
And what about this national security strategy? I mean, is it reshaping expectations when it comes to any Ukrainian peace deal? And should European leaders, should they believe anything that comes from the United States at the moment in terms of peace and peace with Ukraine and Russia?
Well, when you say should they believe what comes from the U.S., certainly trust has eroded significantly. Most Europeans believe they can no longer rely on the United States. President Trump, both as president and before he was president, wasn't someone that usually trust was not one of the first words you would think of when you would describe him in terms of his behavior and his success. But the Trump approach to Ukraine is that he wants the war to be over. And not only is that a priority, but he doesn't really care what the required conditions are to get to that outcome. And if you don't really care, like how you get to a ceasefire, how you get to peace, the easiest way to get to peace is to beat up hard on the little guy. And Trump basically said that. He said, the Ukrainians are losing. And there are some people in his administration that I've spoken with that believe that the Ukrainians truly are starting to lose significantly on the ground, militarily. But even if that were the case, most supporters of Ukraine would not publicly say, hey, our side is losing, because you also lose leverage with the Russians when you say that. But if you don't care what the outcome is, as long as you have a ceasefire, then, Trump is now saying we need the Ukrainians to have elections. He doesn't say that about the Russians. I mean, the Russians are not a dictatorship. We need the Ukrainians to accept giving up some land. Not that the Russians have to leave. And Trump has backed away from a lot of the pressure that he seemed to be putting on Putin over the last couple of months. He's certainly been giving them a lot more additional deadlines, and he's made it a little less urgent.
What about the reactions we've seen here in Europe to all of this? I mean, there has been outrage here over this new national security strategy, especially. We've seen some leaders, they've been noticeably restrained, some have not. And I'm just wondering, it may feel good to vent, particularly when you're a European leader talking about Donald Trump, but that's not going to get you very far. I mean, it doesn't make Europe any less dependent on Trump's America, does it?
Well, Europe is becoming less dependent on Trump's America. Europe is, of course, spending a lot more on defense. And unless Trump were to cut off the willingness of military companies to sell to the Europeans, because it's European taxpayer money, it's not American taxpayer money, that gives the Europeans more leverage over actual Ukrainian outcomes and over their own security. That's changed over the course of the last year. That is a real thing. But when you see President Trump, when you see Elon Musk, when you see J.D. Vance and others talking about the Europeans that they like, who are more Eurosceptic, and the fact that they would like to see some of the far-right parties coming in, suddenly the Europeans are going to start thinking that the Americans are trying to put their finger on the scale against the European Union the way the Russians directly interfere. And that's not the behavior of an ally. That's the behavior of, as I said at the outset, an adversary. And it's going to be very hard because the Europeans are still so dependent on the United States, and in terms of intelligence and the economy and the rest, it's going to be very hard for them to suddenly break those ties. But clearly the message to the Europeans is you need to become a lot stronger, a lot more self-sufficient, as fast as humanly possible.
Well, next week we're going to see the year-end summit among European Union leaders. And at that summit, they're going to have to decide how they're going to come up with it. I think it's about 200 billion euros necessary to keep funding Ukraine and to keep them in this war. Will they use, which is about 210 billion euros in frozen Russian assets, which are sitting in Belgium? I mean, I was just reading today, the European Central Bank is reportedly worried that a move like that would endanger the stability of the euro itself.
I think that European leaders I've spoken to feel that this is an extraordinary priority, that they're very close to getting there. They need to find a way to collateralize these assets that would be seized so that it doesn't all fall on Belgium, as it shouldn't. It's a European decision. If it turns out that there's a legal process and some of these monies at some point are contested and might need to go back to Russia, that's not going to fall all on Belgium. So they need a process for that. They're working it through. It's complicated, but it is urgent. It is a priority. And overwhelmingly, the Europeans, with a couple of small exceptions, feel like this is something that has to be done. So I think it will get done. But the Trump administration has thrown a wrench in this in just the last few days. Say, well, wait a second. We're not sure we want you to seize these Russian assets. These Americans have literally no business saying that to the Europeans. These are sovereign assets that were in European accounts. The Europeans have sovereign determination over what they decide to do with money in their accounts. The Americans wouldn't tolerate it. The Europeans told the Americans what to do with assets that were in American sovereign accounts. But it is startling, and indeed it's privately shocking to the Europeans that President Trump would try to undermine them in that way. the United States, they say that they don't like a weak Europe, that they want Europe to be stronger, but they don't want Europe to take this decision to allow them to more effectively fund the war in Ukraine. They don't want them to start spending their own money on their own weapons systems in Europe. In fact, Trump has said very clearly he wants them spending money on the United States, which means he wants Europe to be more dependent over time on the U.S. So, I mean, you have to watch not just what they write, but also what they actually do. The final point I should make is that the NSS was, of course, at no point did President Trump actually read it. And European leaders should remember that, too.
But, you know, you're confident then that next week we're going to see a decision coming from the EU to use these frozen assets. But how can you be so confident? Because Europe knows if they do that, they could face retribution from Russia. I mean, that's why Belgium has been holding out. And also at the same time, based on what you're saying, if they unfreeze this money and give it to Ukraine, then they're going to get the wrath of Donald Trump as well. So they're going to get hit from both sides by doing this.
I'm reasonably confident that they will come up with a solution that gets the Ukrainians this committed money. And if you made me bet, I would say that it's going to be using these frozen assets in some way, in some manner. I think there is a workaround to be done that will allay Belgium's concerns. But the Europeans are between a rock and a hard place. What is the top priority? The top priority is making sure that they can defend themselves and that Ukraine can defend itself against a much larger, brutal, and illegal Russian invasion. And that is obviously the priority. The Europeans, you'll remember when Zelensky went to the White House, the Europeans all got on planes with 24-hour notice and they joined him in the Oval Office. The Europeans didn't do that on trade. The Europeans didn't do that on the national security strategy. They did it on Ukraine. This feels for the frontline European states, as well as the major European leaders, the Germans, the French, as well as non-EU, the Brits. This is a top priority. And so if they have to make a decision between alienating the Russians, alienating the Americans, and ensuring their own security, they're going to go with the latter.
Ian, unfortunately, we're out of time. Excellent discussion. We will be watching to see what comes out of the EU next week. Ian Bremmer with the Eurasia Group. Ian, thank you.
Good to see you.
Well, I asked GW's Teri Schultz if Trump's remarks about European leaders in NATO, if they've reignited fears that the U.S. is not ready to defend its allies.
I think people are very worried. As you mentioned, back in June, President Trump said that he understood NATO leaders' concerns, and he said, we're here to defend them, to help them protect their countries. Now, of course, he's describing those same leaders as stupid in some cases, as weak, which does give them the feeling that he isn't going to be there to back them up. I think that people would very much like this to turn out to be nothing. But again, when you have the national security strategy there on paper with some very stark language about how the European allies are viewed and putting much more emphasis on Indo-European allies, I think that there's real cause for concern that perhaps this love fest with Trump was a phase and not the part where he sees Europe as, not really stalwart partners.
I remember us talking earlier this year about a time when the head of NATO referred to Donald Trump as daddy. And Trump, he brought up that moment in this interview. Do you think that NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, do you think that now he regrets having said that?
That was at the same summit, and he was referring to Trump having to step into the room, in his words, between Israel and Iran. And that's what it takes sometimes to make peace. Of course, now we see President Trump trying to do that again between Russia and Ukraine with not very good results for Europe. So I think that Mark Rutte, who said at the time that he was not embarrassed by those comments, I think that he still feels that allies, European allies, want him to maintain this rather gratuitous gratuitous posture with President Trump that they really don't see any alternative to keeping him in the alliance, to keeping him in discussion with Europe. And I don't think that he will change his ways. I think we'll continue to see this kind of language, Brent.
Okay. Well, I mean, the language, maybe even the big daddy thinking here. I'm wondering, are European countries, are they already taking practical steps to ensure that they can protect themselves in the event that Daddy Trump, if you will, is a no-show?
Now, this is something that Trump himself has imposed on them, but it may serve them well. And that, of course, is putting more money into their own militaries. That agreement to eventually spend 5% of their GDP on their own defense. That, of course, will come in awfully handy if you don't have the United States coming to back you up, should Russia, as is now believed, has intentions to come across NATO's border. Of course, they are taking other measures on the EU side, which has made possible funding for this new investment in their militaries, allowing the debt ceilings to be lifted, making loans available. The EU very much wants to shore up the European pillar in NATO, and never has that seemed more necessary than now, Brent.
GW's Teri Schultz with the latest tonight from Brussels on Europe, Trump, and the daddy syndrome. Teri, thank you.